Hi, I'm Scott Wolford, a professor of government here at the University of Texas at Austin. I specialize in international politics, especially international conflict and institutions. And I'm going to talk today about the First World War. There's a few ways to think about this. The First World War was a big, messy, complicated event, and you can tell a lot of stories about how it came about. But I think we can boil it down to something fairly simple, which is that the great powers, that is the big major military powers, the empires of the world at the time, were in a period of flux. There were some powers rising, some powers falling, and when one country sees a rival get stronger, it worries that in the future, whatever good deal it has now in terms of territory, wealth, population, prestige, might disappear. And they sometimes have an incentive to attack before things get bad. And we call this a preventive war, where countries will suspect that a rival is growing stronger, they can take something from you in the future, and if decline is certain, then launching a war, which is costly and risky and unpredictable, can make a lot of sense. However horrific it is to choose to start something that might turn into a world war. And in 1914 in Europe, we saw several preventive wars all interlocked and kind of breaking out at once, which is what makes the war unique. So that's your general explanation, but what's specific about 1914 that gave us a world war? The broadest answer is probably the decline of the Ottoman Empire, which we don't really think about when we think of the First World War, but this old, ancient, aging empire is declining, losing influence in the Balkans, which is being eyed by Austria, the Austrian Empire, but the Russian Empire, and the German Empire, which wants to keep the Russian Empire out. If you think this is complicated, just wait. In 1914, Austria decides that it needs to fight a preventive war against Serbia, which has just captured Austrian territory and poses a threat by stirring up Serbian nationalism in the Austrian Empire. Austria wants a preventive war to crush Serbia. Russia's worried about this because Russia can't let Serbia fall, because it will shut the Russians out of the Balkans, because they eventually want Constantinople, today's Istanbul, and access to the Mediterranean. So, Russia eyes this warily. Germany, the big power in Central Europe, is allied with Austria and is considering whether to support Austria in its demands on Serbia. Germany decides it will because it has its own preventive motivations to cut down Russian growth, because the Russians are rearming heavily after losing to Japan all the way around the world in 1905. So, you have three interlocking preventive wars. Austria wants to attack Serbia before it rises too far. Russia needs to prevent Austria from crushing Serbia and dominating the Balkans, and Germany, while it would like to see Austria win on its own and cut the Russians down to size on the cheap, has to back the Austrians to fight a preventive war against Russia. First part of the story, still not a world war. The problem for Germany is that Russia has an ally in France. So Germany attacks France first, so that it can knock them out of the war quickly and then turn to fight the long war against the Russians. And it gets still crazier. But you have France in the war because of a rising Russia that Germany fears. But on the way to France, Germany attacks Belgium, which makes the British worry about Germany dominating the English Channel coast, cutting the British off and ending their time as a great power. So Great Britain joins the war in a preventive capacity of its own to prevent Germany from dominating the European continent. So at this point we have almost all the great powers, except Japan and the United States in the early going, aligned against each other. The central powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the Entente powers of Russia, France, Great Britain, and kind of by default, Serbia. How did they get there? An unusual confluence of preventive wars, all interlocked and all happening at once, like different streams in a river coming together in a way that would be very, very rare. So ultimately what caused the war? It was multiple countries fearing future decline and deciding that inaction was worse than action. What's notable, and this will enter into our discussion of why the U.S. gets in the war as a result of German actions later, is that you don't need great odds to launch a preventive war. You just need to know that inaction is going to be terrible. So, we see Germany and Austria-Hungary launch a war against a coalition of all the other great powers that control the seas, that can even shut Germany and Austria off from vital imports simply because the future looks so dire. The United States' involvement in the First World War is pretty interesting, if only because it had tried so hard to stay out for so long. The U.S. began the war as a neutral country. President Wilson seemed very committed to staying out of the war. In fact, he won re-election in 1916, 2 years into the war, on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Right? Wilson was pretty happy about this and seemed committed to neutrality. And so the decision to join the war against Germany on the side of the Entente seemed strange at the time. Wilson had, as early as January 1917, said that he wanted a peace without victory, which of course scandalized those in the U.S. that wanted to join the war, and Britain and France, who wanted American help in crushing what they believed to be this big imperial German threat. So if we're to explain why the U.S. joins the war, I think we need to step back a bit and think about what Wilson wanted. He wasn't lying when he said he wanted a peace without victory, right? Wilson's first best outcome was to see the great powers effectively exhaust themselves. All the old European empires would wear themselves out, and Wilson could step in and mediate a peace and effectively let American financial and military might dominate the new balance of power without spending any of it. And for a while, this looked pretty good, right? The United States looked the other way while the British blockaded German ports, used a threat of war to keep Germany from using its submarines against the shipping across the Atlantic that kept the Entente afloat. Germany hated this, right? Because the submarine was potentially its best naval weapon, and yet it could do nothing about the fact that the British could get constant resupply from the United States and from its own colonies that provided a ton of wealth and manpower during the war. This looked pretty good for the U.S. Neutrality kept the possibility of a stalemated outcome alive. Second best for the United States was probably an Entente victory. If somebody had to win, Wilson would have preferred the British and the French, right? Because the U.S. Had similar preferences to the British of a global system of free trade and freedom of the seas protected by a big navy. It's just that the U.S. would have preferred that the Royal Navy do it and not the very small, at this point, American Navy. Finally, the worst outcome possible was a German victory. And the key is that by 1917, Wilson's first best outcome, a peace of exhaustion, was not really in the cards anymore. There's a couple of reasons for this. One was that Germany was having success on the Eastern Front fighting Russia. By early 1917, Russia is teetering on the brink of revolution, and Germany is sniffing victory in the East, which they eventually get. However, Germany also knows that this might tip the U.S. into the war, and by 1917, with the major European powers exhausted, American participation would be decisive. The U.S. could raise an army fairly quickly. It was small at this point. It was mostly tied down in Mexico, chasing Pancho Villa, but the U.S. was supremely wealthy. It had already turned into a net creditor on the world financial stage, and it could raise an army really quickly with fresh-legged and not exhausted troops. And by this point in the war, Germany senses victory in the East, also knows that with the U.S. effectively looking the other way on the British blockade and providing tons and tons of credit to the Entente powers, American participation was almost a foregone conclusion. Germany believes the U.S. will step in to prevent a victory, and so by believing it to be certain, Germany takes a step that makes it inevitable, which is that they unleash their submarines in 1917. In late January, early February, the decision is made to try to cut the British Isles off from resupply. They know, the German leadership knows that this is likely to bring the Americans into the war, but they have the choice of bringing the Americans into the war while possibly starving the British Isles and preventing American troops from getting to Europe, or doing nothing with their submarines and letting the Americans get there unmolested. So, staring down the barrel of potential American intervention later, Germany decides that inaction would be worse, and therefore launches unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning it announces that it will sink any vessel approaching the British Isles that it feels necessary to sink. Germany thinks that by unleashing its submarines, it can stall the arrival of American troops, hold on to its potential gains in the east against Russia, eke out a compromise peace against Britain and France, and come out somewhat victorious. But if they wait, if they let the Americans intervene, which they believe is going to happen eventually, they're toast. So it's a desperate gamble in early 1917 that forecloses the chance of a stalemated peace. Germany is rolling the dice for everything in 1917, and Woodrow Wilson realizes his best chance for a peace of exhaustion or peace without victory is out the window. So he takes his second best option, realizing the first best is no longer possible, and the United States joins the war on the side of the Entente. So why does the U.S. join the war? There are popular stories about an embarrassing German telegram proposing an alliance with Mexico, which is more precautionary than anything. But it was really Germany's desire to try to make American intervention to minimize the effects of American intervention, launching the submarines, forcing Wilson's hand, and drawing the U.S. into a war that it would have preferred not to fight. We very much live in the world created by the First World War today. It ended almost a century ago, and if you look around the globe, you can see its footprint almost everywhere. It was called the Great War at the time, before there was a sequel that kind of overshadowed it in everybody's memory. But the First World War was, when it happened, the biggest and bloodiest conflict in global history. It killed nearly 10 million people on the battlefield alone. That's to say nothing of civilian deaths. It required the mobilization of entire populations in a level of industrial warfare and large-scale killing that nobody had seen. It was truly traumatic for the countries that participated in it. And quite apart from the cost, which obviously didn't deter the same countries from fighting again in 1939, it very much changed the face of the world. It destroyed the empire of every country that got defeated in the war. The German Empire, gone. The Austrian Empire, gone. The Ottoman Empire, gone. The Russian Empire, gone. Russia started the war on the winning side but got knocked out of the war in 1917, 1918. It sounded the death knell of the British and French empires, which would hang on like grim death for a few more decades, but eventually disintegrate on their own. It strengthened Japan, and in fact, put Japan's new colonial holdings astride the sea lanes to the American empire in the Pacific, setting up a rivalry that would explode pretty violently in 1941. It created modern Chinese and Indian nationalism as we know it, the latter especially because Britain required so much effort from India to sustain the war effort. If you think about it, Great Britain is tiny, shouldn't be a great power, but without that empire, it wouldn't have been, right? So it set the stage for the disintegration of this huge global empire. It also ended with the United States in a position of unparalleled political, especially financial, and at least potential military power. We like to think of the United States as ending World War II in a predominant position, and it did, but after World War I it did as well. The era of American superpower was really birthed at the end of this war. And so the international system we live in now, where the United States is close to first among equals when it comes to the great powers, we saw flashes of it in 1918, 1919. Now the U.S. tried after the war to manage the new balance of power with financial power, right, by pulling out of Europe. And the aftermath of that war taught American leadership a lesson about how to manage the balance of power after a major war, which was to probably stay involved in Europe and in Asia, though the U.S. was still dragged kicking and screaming into those commitments after World War II. The First World War did a lot more in the carve-up of the Ottoman Empire. It created the modern Middle East. The states that we know, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Israel, Lebanon, right? They had their origins in the carve-up of the old Ottoman Empire. A great deal of the conflicts that are kind of below the surface in East Asia now sprang from the immediate post-war era, where Japan, which had won its place as a great power in 1895 and 1905 by beating China and Russia, Japan found itself extremely disillusioned by the post-war settlement when its request for a racial equality clause in the League of Nations was denied, when it was eventually forced to yield holdings in China and didn't feel like it got the same treatment that the other great powers gave themselves, to which the other great powers were entitled after winning the war. So across Europe, Asia, Africa, which held tons of German colonies at the time, and British and French colonies as well, and the Americas, you see profound changes and rearrangements of the international system that are still with us today.